Ecclesiastes, we're in class 2. Last week we did our introduction to the whole book of Ecclesiastes, and it's such a great book. So many people, though, I've found in just talking about the book of Ecclesiastes, don't like it because it's sort of depressing as you're reading through it, and it's like, man, you're telling me that a lot of stuff is pointless, a lot of stuff is useless, and it can be very depressing, but we've got to remember Solomon is searching for the meaning of life without God. And then all along the way, we're going to see God comes into the picture and his tune will change. And so last week we talked about Solomon because understanding Solomon will really affect the way that we read Ecclesiastes. Solomon was arguably the wealthiest man on the planet at the time that he likely wrote this. He had all kinds of honor and respect from other nations, and he's the king over Israel. So all of that leads us to Solomon had access to anything and everything that he wanted or desired, and we're going to see throughout Ecclesiastes, he tried everything. So when Solomon comes to a conclusion, it means a lot more than, say, if I were like, hey, this is the meaning of life, and you're going to be like, who are you? Why does that matter? It doesn't. But Solomon tried everything, and he's going to be able to say this stuff ain't it or this stuff is it. And so it's really exciting to get into this. Just like we ended last week, I want to start here. We might do this every week. So really quick, go to Ecclesiastes 12, please. Ecclesiastes 12, and we're going to read verses 13 and 14. Probably for a lot of us in the room, this is a familiar passage that we're going to go to. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. And this is these are the final two verses of this entire book. So this is the ultimate conclusion of the entire book. And it says, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So the ultimate conclusion that Solomon is going to have is life without God is meaningless. And the conclusion, the meaning of life is to pursue God, keep his commandments. It applies to every single person. We know that's the conclusion. So as we go through the book, let's be very hesitant, and please don't jump to chapter 12 as we're going along the way. Because as we're going along the way, we're going to read a lot of things that are depressing, things that are going to be very bleak and cloud shadowed. But let's sit in that, because that's the human experience, as we talked about last week. Okay, before we actually get into chapter 1, if you want to turn back to chapter 1, does anybody have any comments or anything leading up to jumping into chapter 1 or anything about Solomon, anything? All right, great. Well, let's start in chapter 1. And before we actually jump into it, I just want us all to really let this hit home as we're reading this. So I want you to think about, do you have somebody in your life, either they've already passed away or maybe they're still alive, that it's just somebody that you look up to beyond anybody else? I mean, when they speak, you ask for their opinion on something, you just know that wisdom is going to come out. And whenever they tell you things, it might be hard truth, but you're going to be more ready to hear it because you respect this person, you love this person, even if they've already passed away. People, you have somebody in your mind right now? I'm sure a lot of us do. Now, I want you to imagine that if they've already passed away or if they're still alive, that they're on their deathbed. And while on their deathbed, they write a letter specifically to you. And then they pass away, and you find out about this letter. I mean, how excited are you going to be to see the contents of this letter? What did this person that I respect, that has all this wisdom, what do they have to reveal to me? You open that letter up, it says your name on the front, you open it up, and the very first line is, everything is pointless. Yeah. I mean, isn't that going to hit you really hard because it's coming from that person? I think that's a really good analogy because, as we talked about last week, Solomon was endowed by God with wisdom, and over the course of his experiences and things, he's the wisest man that ever lived. Aside from Jesus, he's the wisest man that ever lived. And so as we look at chapter 1, which is really sort of a prologue, we're going to see a lot of conclusions in chapter 1 before the search that starts in chapter 2. I mean, that's really what it's going to be. Just imagine the wisest person you know that you respect, and that's what they're going to say. And so as we're reading through these words, maybe even imagine that it's that person that's saying these things. Although it's not, it's Solomon. But just kind of imagining it that way might make it a little bit more personal for us. And again, that's pretty much what Solomon is going to be doing here. So any comments on that before we jump in? All right. Well, chapter 1, again, is going to be sort of a prologue. We're going to see a lot of conclusions before we get to the search. And let me see, do I have anything on this? Let's see. Maybe I should turn it on. Come on now. Aha, life is meaningless. There you go. That's chapter 1. So let's start in verses 1 and 2. 1 and 2. The words of the preacher, your version might say teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So this really is like that whole scenario we were just talking about. You open up that letter, the first line is, everything is pointless. Well, we've got to define some terms. What does vanity mean? Or maybe your translation says a different word there. Futility. Yeah, futility. I think there's one translation that actually says absolute futility. I think it says something like that. Anybody have any other translations there? Or meaningless. Yeah, absolutely. Is that what you were going to say? Okay, yeah, absolutely. And this Hebrew word here is actually the same word that's used for breath or vapor. And so with breath or vapor, we're going to see striving after wind a bunch of times in Ecclesiastes. You can't grasp wind. That's a futile, useless, meaningless endeavor. But also when you think about vapor or breath, it's something that lacks substance. You can't hold on to it because it lacks substance. But also that same word is used in the Old Testament of things that are fleeting. So just like in the New Testament where life is but a vapor, what the point of that is, life is fleeting. So not only is it useless, not only does it lack substance, not only is it futile or meaningless, but it's fleeting on top of being useless and all that stuff. Also, think about in the beginning of verse 2 where my translation says vanity of vanities. Your translation might say futility of futilities or absolute futility. When we think of phrases that say blank of blank, so think about Jesus when it says King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What are we talking about? King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The pinnacle, yes, I think you both said the same word. That was awesome. The pinnacle of the ultimate king, the ultimate Lord. And so here's Solomon saying, vanity of vanities. Of all the things that are useless on planet Earth, all the things that are meaningless, fleeting, and have no substance, he's saying life under the sun, without God, by the way, is the most useless, is the pinnacle of lacking substance, is the preeminent of meaningless. And if this was the person that we all have in our minds and in our hearts, that when they speak, we just know wisdom's coming out. And that's what they say to you. You think your ears are going to perk up a little bit? This is intense. Life under the sun is useless without God, is what Solomon is saying. Any thoughts on verses 1 and 2 here? Yes, sir.
I always find it because I think a lot of First Corinthians, when I think about this passage, specifically that has God not made foolish wisdom of this world foolish? And there's something, the idea of wisdom in general is completely relative, right? Like your wisdom is different from my wisdom, but you find wise, I find wise. A fool's wisdom is going to be wise to another fool, but then an actual wise man might find that foolish as well, right?
Like Proverbs.
So God's created this new standard to say, the more wisdom you find in me, the more you find foolish wisdom of this earth. And that's really awesome that he's creating this actual standardization of what wisdom is, that we don't have to worry about who's wiser among the more ephemeral things of this life.
Yeah, that's exactly, and hold on to that too, because the very last couple of verses of chapter 1 is going to exactly that. So that's absolutely correct. Anybody else? Any thoughts? It's sort of a bleak view of human existence, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to tell a teenager who's asking you what's the meaning of life, and you're saying, well, why don't I go and see what the wisest man had to say about it? And you open up chapter 1, verse 2, it's all pointless and it's all fleeting, it's meaningless and lacking substance. That's pretty bleak. And I think we probably ask the question, well, why is that? And that's exactly where Solomon goes next. And this is just a master class of how to get your point across. So let's look at verse 3 and 4 really quickly here, 3 and 4. And remember, as we're going along, one of the things I want to focus on is the questions that Solomon asked. If you have a little green colored pencil or marker or something, every time you see a question, it'd be a great thing to do to circle that verse number in green so that you can see it, because he answers these questions. So verse 3, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? What advantage is there in all the toil and all the work that man does under his sun? Verse 4, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. So here in these verses, he's asking this question. In the next following verses, he's going to be answering that question. What advantage is there? He's already said the conclusion, so we already kind of know what his answer is. But he's saying, what advantage is there to all the work that men do, all their toil in life under the sun. And remember, when we see under the sun, the vast majority of times throughout Ecclesiastes, that's without God, under the sun without God. We're going to see times where it is with God, but most of the time it's not going to be. And so he says in verse 4, a generation goes and a generation comes and the earth remains forever. So I'm going to do all this work, and you know what's just going to happen to me? I'm just going to die like everybody else that came before me. And then another generation is going to come up, and you know what's going to happen to them? They're going to die too. So why am I working so hard? Why am I toiling so hard if the only thing that's going to happen is I'm going to die and a generation is going to come in after me? So the answer to his question in verse 3 so far is that there's no advantage to all this toil. There's no advantage to all this work if it's just life under the sun, because the earth just remains forever. Things stay the same and generations pass away. Any thoughts on that before we keep going? Okay. Let's read on a little bit, because where it says the earth remains forever, I think Solomon expounds on that even more. Look at verse 5, and let's read 5 through 7. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses, the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. And so when we look at these verses, really we see the cycles of nature being presented here. You know, he's saying that life under the sun is cyclical. It's according to cycles. It's repetitive, and it's just the nature of life, that things just continue the way that they have been as far as nature is concerned. He says the sun rises, you know what it's going to do? And it's going to set. The wind will blow to the north and it'll go back to the south. You know, the rivers will go into the sea, but the sea's not full, and that water just returns back to where it was. So Solomon's saying, no matter, remember, we're answering a question in verse 3. What advantage is to all this toil, all this work that a man labors all under the sun? And he's saying, if you look around at nature, no matter how much typing I do on my computer at work, no matter how many boxes I move onto the truck at work, no matter how many things that I toil in and labor in, you know what's still going to happen? That sun's still going to rise and it's still going to set. That wind is still going to blow and go to the places that it goes. The waters are still going to do what they do, and nothing that I do is really going to affect that. So to answer his question, what advantage is there? He's saying, well, there's nothing. There isn't an advantage. Yes, sir.
Any college graduation or high school graduations, they'll generally have a keynote speaker who will speak to the graduates and will talk to them about the idea of making your mark in the world, whatever terminology they use. Solomon would probably be not someone that you would want to advise to do that, but yet his advice is the best advice ever given for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to see more about that here in this same chapter. Eddie's point was, you know, so many keynote speakers at a graduation are make your mark on the world, you know, make your name known. And Solomon would probably be the worst keynote speaker that you could invite, because he would have a problem with that. And yet it's the wisdom that comes from God. Yes, sir.
Another thing I think out of the background of this thinking period, we work so hard to do something in the world, but there's something influencing the world that causes it to go on in spite of our work.
Yeah.
And that's because he says it just keeps going. We come and go, but it keeps going. That is, he's going up and going to get to God. Doesn't identify it here. He's implying or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan was just saying that something that's in the background here that's not explicitly stated is one of the reasons why it's so useless and futile and fleeting is because if it's just life under the sun without God, and you just see these cycles, that's all there is. And you're trying to make your mark and it's not going to do anything. But in the background, there is someone who is ordering these things, who's causing it to continue to go on. And with him out of the picture, you're missing the whole picture. And that's what Dan was saying. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Those not time for here too. There's something, it's like Solomon through God is flipping the paradigm too, because if I were to read this passage without God in mind, it would sound very defeatist, very nihilistic, right? But then you put God in the picture, like, it's actually not hopeful, really, anyway.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter, because you got God,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so much of this book is going to be depressing from Solomon's standpoint of where he's searching for these things. But we know later on, and what his conclusion is going to be, that with God in the picture, all of those things, it shifts. And I think you said paradigm shift. Did you say that? Yeah, paradigm shift is a great way to say that. because what is useless to the world is hopeful to the child of God. And so that's a great comment to bring up there too. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, let's look at this next verse here. I really like verse 8 because it just so well encapsulates human experience. Verse 8, all things are wearisome. I mean, if again, like we're just talking about, if you are only looking at life under the sun without God and you notice that things repeat, doesn't matter how much work you do, all things are wearisome. That's going to be your conclusion. Look at the end of verse 8 here. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. So life is unfulfilling. Not only is it cyclical, repetitive, and things stay the same, but life under the sun is unfulfilling. Even in, because he's been talking about nature, even in the context of nature. Think about beautiful sunsets. We love watching a beautiful sunset, right? And seeing it. Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. But I'm willing to bet that part of why us in the room, why we like sunsets, is because we have a bigger picture than, there's some atoms up there, there's some hydrogen up there, and all these things. But the reason we think it's so beautiful is we have something outside of this physical existence that we're saying, wow, look at the God who made that. And even for us who are religious and we know that and we believe in God, as soon as a couple minutes go by, that sunset is gone. And you're never going to see that sunset again. And no matter how many beautiful sunsets you've seen in your life, do you want to see another sunset? Yeah, you do, because the eye is not satisfied with seeing and the ear is not satisfied with hearing. You hear a beautiful symphony from some orchestra here in Lexington. Oh, that's wonderful. It's amazing. Do you want to hear another one? Probably, because our ear isn't satisfied with hearing, even if it's from a good-hearted place and even from a faith-filled place. But you take this from Solomon's point of view, which is under the sun without God, even more so, because the moment that you're looking at that sunset, hey, that's great and all, but it's just atoms, it's just hydrogen, it's just nitrogen up there doing whatever those things do to make this beautiful sunset. And you know what? It's gone. So let's go look at another one. And that just so well encapsulates life under the sun. It's unfulfilling. Another thing on being unfulfilling, I saw this quote from Dave Ramsey. We love Dave Ramsey, right? He said something, if you eat enough lobster, it eventually tastes like soap. And I love that quote because that is life under the sun. So if you think about, hey, it's my wedding anniversary and once a year we go get a lobster dinner. No, that's special. That means a lot. Oh, it tastes so good. But say you start getting lobster once every week. Hey, it probably still tastes pretty good, but maybe over time, like what he's saying, it eventually tastes like soap. And it's because we get used to things. And our eye is not satisfied with seeing, and the ear is not satisfied with hearing. We could say our tongue isn't satisfied with tasting either. We always are wanting more. It's unfulfilling. If all there is life under the sun, we're constantly wanting more, and we're unfulfilled. And Solomon just so well encapsulates that for us. Any other thoughts on verse 8 here? Yes, sir.
Someone has a little bit of thought about IRE. All these cycles. Well, can that lead them to God? You know what I mean? But if you're completely devoid of that, then it's just place. But I thought I love Romans 1, but all these things can make us think of God if we have the heart open to that and the world to be led in. As you said, when we see those things, it confirms our faith. But there's got to be, God will keep me devoid of that. Also got to be open.
Yeah, absolutely. The things of nature or thinking about the science behind the cycles of life that Solomon's talking about here can lead us to God. And it's so fascinating, though, how many times we talk about, say, the cycles that we're talking about, the cycles, the water cycle, any of those cycles, and we say, okay, why does it rain? And we start saying, well, because water evaporates and then it condensates and then it, all that stuff. And really, we're not even answering the question why. We're really answering the question what. We're really saying what's happening. We're not saying why it's happening. And so we can look to the scientific processes that God has ordered in the universe. And so often we can say, well, this is why this happens, but really we're only answering the question what. That's what's happening. That's not the why it's happening. And wow, when we start asking those questions, that can really lead us to some Romans 1. His invisible attributes have been clearly seen. So absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
But
You're fired.
this
Just kidding.
This book is fascinating to me. And this word here of meaningless or vanity, I don't know if anybody's come up with this or not, or said this, but the idea of life being meaningless to me always felt like it's, you know, as you said, it's sort of a depressing idea. But I heard somebody say sometimes that really the meaning of that word is like vapor, or like that it can't be grabbed, it can't be held. I've seen a documentary where in a big metropolis town, parts of the area, parts of that town were dilapidated, left alone, and eventually like the buildings that were there got retaken over by rolling things. The things that we do, as Solomon says, the writer says, nothing lasts. So what are we doing to make sure that our time here is?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talked about that Hebrew word a little bit because it's related to breath or vapor. So something that can't be grasped is a great thing to bring up. It lacks substance. You can't grab onto it, and it's fleeting. And so I like your application of that, which is what are you doing with your time? Because it's not going to last. So what are you doing? Yes, sir.
Maybe just to add a little bit of a brighter context. Just because something is meaningless doesn't mean it can't also be enjoyed. Riding a roller coaster is pretty meaningless, but it's still a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And so there are much broader, more important points than that to be made in this study, but we don't have to get too involved in this idea of pointless and meaningless, even in the physical sense. I understand the spiritual point is much broader and more important, but you can still enjoy it. I went to a car show yesterday, it's pretty meaningless, but it's fun for my son, so we can still have a bit of a positive slant on that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. And Solomon's going to bring that up several times throughout too. And if you didn't hear what he said, that things can be meaningless and still be enjoyable. And what was the first one? Roller coaster? Like a roller coaster. That's pretty meaningless, riding a roller coaster, but it's still fun. Going to a car show is pretty meaningless, but it's still enjoyable. So that's a great point to bring up. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, to kind of add on, not just enjoyable, but also useful. Like money is ultimately meaningless, but we can do a lot of good with the money that we make. We take a collection every Sunday for that very purpose. So, again, in thinking about utility and meaningless, ultimately meaningless, but not completely meaningless.
Yeah, that's a great thing. It can be useful as well. So money was the example that Adam just brought up. Ultimately meaningless, but still useful. And that's a great thing to bring up. And so as we're going through Ecclesiastes, so much of this is focused on the ultimate fulfillment factor. Ultimate fulfillment factor, that it's not going to be ultimately fulfilling, even if short-term it's useful, short-term enjoyable. But those are great points to bring up. And Solomon's going to bring those up all along the way. Yes, sir.
The way he's beginning the book is with what we would call a very big picture. Are you going to change the world? No, you're not going to change the world. In the next section that we're about to get to, are you going to change people? Ultimately, you're not going to change people. But I think the points that we're talking about, which Solomon's going to get into in detail, is I can affect my portion of the world, and I can have an effect on people that I have relationships with. And so ultimately, looking at it from that perspective, that's where the true meaning of life is. It's not that I'm going to change everything.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up too, especially in this prologue where he's saying you're not going to have an impact on the world. Like, again, terrible keynote speaker for graduation, but you're not going to change the world, but you can change things that you do in your life, and you can affect your sphere of influence that you're involved in. But things very broadly, ultimate fulfillment, you're not going to change the world. That's a great point to bring up. Anything else before we keep going? We're running low on time. This is great. And one of the things I love about Ecclesiastes is that it is so much about human experience that it leaves so much room for us to talk about our experiences and things that we see and things that happen to us, because it's the human experience in a book, just like this whole book is. But anyway, let's keep going here. We just read verse 8. Let's look at verse 9. That which has been is that which will be, And that which has been done is that which will be done. So there is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. And so we're still answering the question that's in verse 3. What advantage is there to all the work that man does in his life under the sun? What advantage is there to all the toil? And from this verse, again, Solomon's saying there isn't an advantage from all that work, because the things that are around today, it's the same stuff that's always been around. The things that are, you think, hey, this thing is new. By the way, I think this is a transitional verse as we get into the next question of verse 10. But he's saying all of these things are just repeats of things that have happened before. It might be different faces, might be different voices, but this has all happened before. We have sayings like, how does it go? Those who don't learn the lessons of history, are doomed to repeat it, because things just repeat. It's just different faces, different names, same ideas, same problems that humans have repeat over and over again. And with that, let's look at verse 10, because I think, again, verse 9 is a transitional verse leading us to the question in verse 10. Verse 10, is there anything of which one might say, see this, it is new? Well, already it has existed for ages which were before us. There's no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur, there will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. And so in these verses, history repeats itself. Is there anything that's new? There's a British, I think he was British, a British reporter. And I found a quote from him, and it says, all new news is old news happening to new people. I thought that was great, because again, history repeats itself. We see ideas stick around. We see that the problem of sin has not gone away. People are people. People make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And so when we get to verse 10, Solomon's like, is there anything that somebody can say, see this? This is new. Well, the answer to that is no. And I was talking about this with somebody, I think last year. They said, what about Ferraris and Xboxes and YouTube and iPads? They didn't have any of that stuff. And it was such a great conversation, because this man actually brought this up to me. He was like, when you really boil all those things down, it's a form of entertainment, it's a form of transportation, it's a form of whatever it is. And there's just new forms of things that have been going on since the beginning of time. It might look different. It might be wrapped up in a new package. It might, this is brand new. Nobody's ever had anything like this. Like, hey, we had carrier pigeons back in the day. That was our iPhone. We had whatever, we had all this stuff. We could still talk to people. It's a new form of doing something that we've already done. And really the most important part of this is that people are still the same. Over time, no matter how much progress we think that we're making, people are still people. The problems that people still have are still the problems that people still have. And one of the things I love about that, because in verse 11, Solomon says, there's no remembrance of earlier things. That really right there is the people who don't learn the lessons from history are doomed to repeat it. If we don't know our history, we're going to repeat it. Also of the later things which will occur. He's saying there's things in the future that are going to happen, and there's going to be no remembrance for them, the end of verse 11, among those who will come later still. So again, you're trying to make your mark on the world. Oh, we're going to change the world. Guess what, buddy? In maybe 2 generations, 3 generations, no one's going to even know you existed. And so Solomon, answering these questions, what advantage is there to all this toil and work? And is there anything of one might say, see, this is new? He's saying, no, that's not the case. And as doom and gloom as it might seem, let's bring it really close to home. Does anybody remember? I'm sure there's going to be somebody, because this is just what happens. Does anybody remember their great grandmother's name? Great grandmother's name? I don't. Maybe there's somebody in here who does. Good for you. But the majority of us, that's somebody in our own family. I mean, how much more important can you get, right? That's somebody in our own family, and we don't even know her name, right? We forget things. We don't remember things. We don't learn. And maybe for me, my great grandmother has some life lessons that, man, if I would just learn those now, I would be set for the rest of my life. But there's no remembrance of earlier things. And from verse 4, a generation goes and a generation comes, and the earth remains forever. It remains the same. Things just keep happening. So what advantage is there? Solomon's saying that there is no advantage. Is there anything that you can say, see this, it's new? And the answer is no. Any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
But the things that you study in those history classes, in general, are the people that did something first.
Mm.
We put a lot of emphasis on that, either something that they did worse, something very, very bad, or something very, very good. And yet, those things too, has to have a cascade of repetition. But we get so focused on that. I was thinking, when I was teaching painting at university, one of the points I would make to my students was, in their conception, their execution of their individual paintings, their goal should be that they're going to make the best painting that's ever been made.
Mm.
But I think we all knew that they were blinded. But don't let that be all until they're in grad school or somewhere.
Yeah.
But we can't go through life accepting that it's meaningless if we're going to get through life.
Hmm.
It's about me judging that car show. I saw a show yesterday that is meaningful to me, or I wouldn't be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean it has meaning to my existence or to my hope of heaven, but it has meaning to me in other ways that are both personally satisfying and satisfying in the way that work with the Concord does charity or organization. So I'm happy to be a part of that. Because that's what we right. That people go out with it 100 years of cars for specific pastime.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point to bring up, that again, just because it's not ultimately fulfilling doesn't mean it's not in the short term or enjoyable. And Solomon's going to have a lot to say about that. But I really liked what you said at the beginning there about how in history, just in general, when we think about history, we like to really focus on people who were the first to do something and people who were the big names of history. And even in those firsts and those big names of history, just a couple of years goes by and we don't remember. And maybe we remember like the really, really big names, but take Rome, for example. You know, people say, oh, the civilization of Rome was just the most powerful, so many amazing things. Can you tell me right off the cuff who the third emperor of Rome was? I know some of you in here could. But most people can't. Or you say, oh man, Alexander the Great. Who was his first general under him? I don't know. How many years did it take him to do all these things? I don't know. Who was the 8th president of the United States? I don't know. I'm sure someone in here does. I know that's just what happens. But anyway, all of those things, it's such a great reminder for us that even if things are enjoyable in the short term or things have some fulfillment for us, in the ultimate fulfillment, they're not, even if we want to make our mark in history. Any other thoughts so far? Okay. All right. Let's look at this last section, verses, let's see, 12 through 18. 12 through 18, please. We're doing pretty good on time-wise. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, this is his conclusion, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked can't be straightened, and what is lacking can't be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. My mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and a wealth of knowledge, and I set my mind to know wisdom, to know madness and folly. I realized this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom, there's much grief, and in increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I really love this section because we're still in this prologue where Solomon is making a lot of conclusions before he gets into the journey. Have you ever watched a movie where it starts and it's like an action scene and they're like, I bet you're wondering how I got in this joint. Let me tell you how this happened. And then it jumps back a few years and it gives you the whole story, or a book like that. That's really what Solomon is doing here. He's given us a bunch of conclusions about how life is useless, it's unfulfilling, it's repetitive and cyclical, it's insignificant. And then he's saying, let me tell you how I got into this mess. And so in these verses, we could almost label this like the preacher, the teacher's quest. You know, this is what he set out to do. And he's going to give us some conclusions in this quest. But he's like, look, this is what I set out to do. Here in verse 13, he says, I set my mind to seek out, to search, to explore by wisdom concerning all that's done under heaven. And he gives us a conclusion already about that. He says it's a grievous task. You know, you think about philosophy, that's sort of what we're talking about here, is searching and exploring the meanings to things. And I think if you watch movies or read a lot of books or you think about philosophers, it's very heavily romanticized. I've been sitting around and I've been thinking all day. They've got that statue in New York of the thinker, oh, it's romanticized. What a great endeavor. What does Solomon say about that? He says it's a grievous task. And we're going to talk about one of the reasons why it's such a grievous task. But one of the things in verse 15, he says, there are things in life that are crooked that you cannot straighten. From verse 3, where he says, what advantage is there for all the toil and the work that a man does? Every single one of us who's lived more than 6 minutes knows there are things in this life, people, places, experiences, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many good things you do, you cannot fix the problem, right? There are things that are crooked that cannot be straightened. Isn't that frustrating? One of the freedoms, though, of Ecclesiastes is going to be like, this is the reality of life, let it go. But right now, when you're trying to seek out and search for meaning and you're trying to find out how to fix all these things, one of Solomon's conclusions is there are things that are crooked and you can't straighten it, no matter how hard you try. Then on top of that, he says there are things that are lacking which can't be counted. It kind of has the idea of accounting there. There are things that you can't account for. There are things that no matter how hard you try, you can't account for the things that are lacking in these specific areas. And where that can be so frustrating for us, it's a grievous task, Solomon says. There's going to be freedom that comes from that. Any thoughts before we keep going? Yes, sir.
Genesis 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 2, God made a perfect world for man to live in, but he told him, in the day you eat of this tree that I forbid you to eat, you will die. And then in chapter 3, he gave the curse to both man and woman. And that curse is what Solomon is talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
That this world will continue to be troubled. There will continue to be weeds. There will continue to be sweat on the brow. That's never going to change as long as this world lasts.
Yeah, that's a great point. Eddie was just saying this really encapsulates Genesis 2 and 3. God creates the perfect world, man messes it up, and all the problems that came about right then are still continuing today. And so that's a great thing to bring up. Somebody else had a hand up. Yes, sir.
To get to the next level, you have to understand the level. You won't get any further if you don't get that base or that foundation. Grass. Division, I have no chance in algebra. So there's this one point, like what Nate brought up, I can't. So this was my least favorite book by far, especially at FC when we went through it. I was just like so depressing. Really, it was my least favorite.
I appreciate you saying that too.
I didn't enjoy it at all. But if we go by what Nate's sharing of the definition, which I hadn't heard before, where it's not meaningless, meaning it doesn't matter, it's just something we can't grasp and take with us, right? It changes the entire context of what this is saying. Because, okay, my dad's gone and it wasn't meaningless, he'll be forgotten. My grandson will never know him, ever. But it wasn't meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I can't grasp and hold and take with me or really pass on directly. The way God's created the world. Just like you said, a roller coaster, but let's just even say going out, see the beautiful park. Grand Canyon. I guess you could say it's meaningless. We saw it, it's done. But it's not meaningless. It's just something I can't grasp and take with me. But to use my definition of what I always thought meaningless is, it would be like God's creation doesn't matter. And this life he gave me, I think it's the opposite. It's almost like when we say we're not worthy, it's always such a struggle for me when we say we're not worthy, God died for us and we're so terrible. I sit back and go, I think we have extremely important value because he did die for me.
Yeah, that's true.
Like he loved me that much. I'm not the worst of the worst. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Like I almost think like I need personally clarity when it says it's meaning. I mean, I love that it's grasping for wind. That seems to make sense. That it's just saying, not that it has no purpose, but that you can't own it, can't really take
Yeah. So one of the things that's amazing about Ecclesiastes is I agree with you, and I'm going to push back just a little bit because the Hebrew word that is used there is used in the Old Testament both ways of useless, futility, and meaningless, and also of vapor and breath, something that can't be grasped or something that's fleeting, I think might even be a more accurate way to say that. And so I think one of the genius things that's in the wisdom of Solomon in this book is that it is both. And I think the clear distinction we have to make is life under the sun without God versus life under the sun with God. So much of this book is going to be life under the sun without God because Solomon is going to argue that I'm trying to think of what your examples were. Your dad was one of the examples. Yeah. Yeah, so something like that. Solomon is saying life under the sun without God, that is meaningless because everyone's going to die, another generation is going to come, and it's just going to continue the way that it was. But we know as Christians, and we have everything else, and we're going to see even in Ecclesiastes that life with God under the sun, it's not meaningless. And so I think that's one of the difficulties about this book is parsing out the specific times when it's life under the sun without God and then life under the sun with God, because we're going to see two completely different stories entirely. And just like you said with nature too, nature is beautiful, it's wonderful. But one of Solomon's conclusions is going to be if this is all there is and there's no God, there's nothing else, even this beauty is meaningless because I'm going to die and that's it and it's over. And so it is both. It's something that's fleeting that we can't grasp, but it also, without God, is meaningless. It is useless. It is absolute futility, some of them say. Does that help at all? Because the word itself, I'll give you a list later of passages in both. I think it'll help a little bit. Okay, we're in our last couple of minutes here, and let's cover these last verses really quickly here. Verse 16, Solomon says, I've magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and of knowledge. Last week we went through and talked about Solomon's wisdom and how kings and queens were coming to him, paying tribute, all kinds of honor because of this. But then look at verse 17. I set my mind to know wisdom, to know madness and folly, and I realized that this also is striving after wind. So this is another great example of what Ted was just talking about. If we read through the Proverbs, is wisdom a good thing? Absolutely. When we read through Proverbs, wisdom repeatedly is a good thing. But here in Ecclesiastes, I think focusing on life under the sun without God, Solomon is saying, even this wisdom, even knowing madness and folly, he says that's striving after wind. That is something that can't be grasped. It's something that isn't worthwhile because I'm just going to die and it's all going to be gone. So it's really important for us to see the difference between life under the sun and life under the sun without God, or I'm sorry, with God. Verse 18, because in much wisdom, there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. And this goes very well with what Ted was just saying about math. You know, you have to understand division before you get to algebra. And it's almost like Solomon is saying, every level I go up, there's increasing pain. I don't know about you, that was kind of my experience with math too, by the way. But with increasing levels, there's increasing pain because the more you know you don't know, or the more you realize how broken things are. The more you know, the more wisdom you have, the more you realize that nobody is attaining to these standards that maybe even your wisdom is telling you to gain to. In increasing knowledge, there's increasing pain. And again, with this, it has to be related to life under the sun without God. Because if we're talking about increasing knowledge and wisdom of the things of God, is there anyone in the room who would say, well, that's increasing pain? Maybe in a way, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing. But here without God, it's just increasing pain. Yes, sir.
17, I think is often neglected in understanding both sides of what Solomon talks about. He talks about, first of all, increasing wisdom and how that ultimately has no benefit. But people will just stop at that and say, okay, then I'm just gonna do what I want, I'm complete myself.
Yeah.
He says that's also of no benefit.
Uh-huh.
And so the reason why it's of no benefit is because in either case, I'm doing it for myself.
Yeah.
And if I'm doing it for myself, then no, there is no benefit.
That's exactly right. And that leads us right into chapter 2, which is exactly what he's going to explore next. Really quickly before we go this morning, life under the sun without God versus life under the sun with God is going to be the huge difference maker throughout this whole book of Ecclesiastes. And if the natural world is all there is, then it is meaningless, it's fleeting, and it lacks substance. But with God, that's where we see a big difference. So read chapter 2, please, before next Sunday, and Lord willing, we'll jump into it then. Thank you very much for all your comments.